Hi everyone, thanks for making the left turn for today, Saturday, August 26th, 2017. I'm George Farrar and welcome back to the Jax Left channel and welcome back to our continuing series, Who Runs Jacksonville, where I look at the people and organizations that run Jacksonville, Florida. And of course, as you know, this summer I've been looking at our television stations, specifically the television stations, the corporate television stations that broadcast news to the people of Jacksonville. That's a lot of power to have, to be broadcasting news and telling people what's going on, and perhaps maybe kind of tilting a little bit on the opinion. I've got a lot to tell you. I've got a lot to show you. I've got a lot to bring to you. And, you know, we've been looking at this summer these TV stations and what they're doing. So it's time now to look at the 6 p.m. reports that were broadcast at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, August the 16th, 2017. I have a lot to talk with you about. We're going to look at the different stations and the different ways they reported the news. And this has been something that, the series has been something that's been really fascinating to me, and I hope to you. I've been looking at all these different things, but you know what? We have something that happened in common for the city of Jacksonville, and these were these events that were going on. A woman is run over by a car and killed by a man. A federal judge rules that former Congresswoman Corrine Brown will not get a new trial but can proceed with sentencing and appeals. The new city council president, Anna Broche, receives hate mail. And then there talk about issues of white supremacy, hate groups, and crime. And a man is sentenced to life in prison without parole for murder. And there's so many other stories. I'm going to look at them. I'm going to start with WJXT, Channel 4, the local station. They described themselves as the local station. And at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, August 16th, Tom Wills and Mary Bear presented the 6 o'clock report, News for Jax. It's called News for Jax. And just to let you know, Channel 4 is an independent station. They are owned by Graham Holdings. And I talked a little bit about that. I talked about advertising, talked about ownership and on earlier episodes. So now we're going to talk about the top story that News for Jax presented. They spent 5 minutes talking about Corrine Brown, former Congresswoman. They had a live stand-up from Jim Piggott downtown at the federal courthouse. I really like Jim Piggott. They did do an interview with Brown's attorney, a phone interview. They have an attorney give his analysis, but they really, after that point though, they went back to the studio and they showed some unflattering pictures of Congresswoman Brown, and they really dove into talking about the likelihood of sentencing and appeals, the timing on when she would go to jail. It doesn't surprise me in a sense that they are presenting that sort of detail, but what did disappoint me was the level of propaganda, the level of display. It was slightly jarring a bit. They spent a lot of time on it compared to other news stations. Now, when it came to the rest of the stories, there were these different stories. You know, they talked about a mother who was run over by a car by a man, and she died, and they interviewed an anonymous neighbor. They talked about the man's criminal history. There was a court appearance for a man who had been given a hard time, an African-American who had been given a hard time by a white JSO officer, and so a court date was set, and there was a brief interview with Devontae Shipman. There's also a real deep dive into looking at juvenile sentences. There was a Supreme Court decision causing the current inmates to be resentenced. And they spent a lot of time on that. They went to commercial. They then came back. They talked about some crime alerts. They talked about an armed robbery and showed a description of the suspect, and a wallet thief and showed his picture. They did an investigation, looked at investigation of daycare, and then they had some interesting stuff. They had interesting things with the Green Cove Springs police officers who had wrangled a rattlesnake, showed a picture of that and a viewer video of a rattlesnake. And so they also, they did a good job on the weather. I really like John Gahn. John Gahn is excellent. They went to commercial. They came back with another crime alert, a smash and grab, and they showed map. They really showed where that neighborhood was, and they also talked about on all the new Aldi grand opening set for the St. John Center and the Volstead Bar changing hands and remaining open instead of being closed. And they had then gone to commercial. But really looking at the analysis that we have of WJXT, News for Jax, I think they're very accurate in the saying that they're the local station. Simple graphics, but a lot of information in a very short period of time. Disturbed by the way they treated former Congresswoman Corrine Brown. Concerns about the way that was done. A bit of piling on. They kind of spent a lot of time on that when they could have maybe spent a little more time on other things. Notice there was no sports coverage. Not a big deal because they really dove deep. I watch them not as often, but I do watch them. And it's a rather relaxing watch. They're not all up in your face, okay? JXT. All right, now we're looking at WTLV, and we're looking at WJXX. Now, the reason I say both these stations at the same time is that they both have, you'll see on two of the TV stations, you'll see on WTLV and WJXX the same news broadcast. And so I'll be talking about what you would see on JXX and on JXT. And these are network affiliates, so at the end of the broadcast, they go to their respective network news. And these stations are owned by Tegna, formerly Gannett. Okay, so top story, the way they reported it was a 1-minute stand-up by Jason Reptila, a reporter. He talked about what was happening with Corrine Brown, and there was a brief talk with a legal analyst who talked about the appeals process. And then they went right on into, they said, well, they'll be sentencing in November. So it was a very quick top story. Then they went to coverage of man sentenced to life for arranging gang members to kill a security guard who would be witnessing in a trial against him. So he was sentenced to life. Then Tim Deegan came on, meteorologist, really nice guy. Tim Deegan talked about storms over parts of Clay and Putnam counties. Then they talked about the University of Florida denying permission for a white supremacist event at UF, and they did interviews with concerned UF students. I noticed they did broadcast. They broadcast pictures of the University of Florida. Then they talked about the Jacksonville connection, a person that was at the Charlottesville rally that had ties to the KKK and League of the South. A reporter named Clark Foraker brought that information. And then it went to Ken Amaro, who talked with a rabbi about bigotry and about hate groups. And he also talked to a woman who talked about her husband's prediction that there would be a resurgence in white supremacy and his concern about militias. And then there was a story about Trump disbanding his business council. They started going into national stories. Went to commercials. When they came back, they talked about the run that was on Eclipse glasses. Stores were sold out of Eclipse glasses. Tim Deegan was sporting them, wearing a pair. And they then went to the weather. They then went to commercial. They came back with some sports. They talked. There was a brief shot of Blake Bortles, quarterback Blake Bortles, talking about his frustration about what's going on in practice. They went to commercial and came back and looked back. Took one last look at the weather map, and then they went on to their respective network news broadcasts at 6:30. JXX going to ABC, TLV going to NBC for the news, for the national news broadcast. So. All right, so, the thing I look at this, very interesting with this particular station, these two stations, is that they run, if you go into different cities, you'll see the same templates that's used at some stations. They use it on their station broadcast here in Jacksonville. And I feel sometimes, though, that they could go more in depth, but they did a great job fusing national issues going on with what's going on here in Jacksonville. That was a very good, strong point for TLV and JXX. So now we go to, yes, we go to another duopoly, the CBS 47, Fox 30, Action News team duopoly. They will look at, again, that same instance of carbon copy journalism, same broadcast on two different stations. So we'll look at WJX TV, which also broadcast the same broadcast except with different ads on the other station, WFOX. And they are owned by Cox Media Group. And I'll go into talking then about the top story with them. Now, I've been a big fan of Action News for quite a while, which is ironic given some of the affiliation with Fox. But they have some good broadcasting that they do. And on the 6 o'clock report, they had John Bachman and Tanika Hughes. And the top story was the woman that was run over by the car, by the man. They had specific, really close-in pictures of the crime scene. They did interview an anonymous neighbor. And they then went on to other stories, particularly a national story, the recognition of the victim in Charlottesville. So they talked about that. There was a slide of a statement from the University of Florida president denying the white supremacy event to be held. They then had a brief interview with City Council President Anna Brosh about hate emails she'd received. And reporter Michael Yoshida on this right in front of the City Hall did a live report. And there was denial about something that had come from the president of Kaiser University. The university denied it, saying that their president had nothing to do with a hate email that was sent. They're tracing it back to hate emails coming out of all places, possibly the Czech Republic. So there was reaction about what was going on. The city council president, new city council president, has been making a stand. There are multiple statements from people about differing issues. There are different opinions about what should happen with Confederate statues and names and that and so forth. Then Mike Burrish talked about storms in Putnam and Clay County. He said they were hit or miss, so not as much coverage. Said, this is going on. And then, of course, all these different stations have promoted their website. This station promoted their mobile app. Okay. Then these two stations promoted their mobile apps. Then there was a brief report that the Corrine Brown, that the federal judge ruled that Corrine Brown, former congresswoman, would not have a new trial. But in comparison with the other two stations, this one was a little bit more refined and very quick and simple. Then they talked about the gang arrests that were being done by the Jackson Sheriff's Office. An interview with the sheriff and the lieutenant and they talked about JSO is sending a clear message. Okay, that's all right. A woman was found safe. Councilman Garrett Dennis. They talked about his push for after-school funding for children. Also, the mayor had been pushing for that as well. Federal government wants more information from CSX about illegal or about possible problems, things that they're doing that are not appropriate on the railroads. And they had been looking at CSX, so they kind of tooted their own horn a little bit. Mike Burrish showed weather map. And then what I found was really interesting with them was that they broadcast footage from their traffic cam. The traffic camera at Beach Boulevard and St. John's Bluff, showing the traffic and the weather. Whenever a station can do that, that's a good thing. Also, then they went to commercial. Then they came back, and there was video of man tasered by Jacksonville Beach police outside a bar. There were threats by cops that they were going to taser a woman. They talked to the woman that was threatened. They talked to the man who was tasered. And, of course, he claimed, I'm just a victim, And then there was a witness who said that it was justified. So I think there was a really good back and forth on that. And then there was even more. There were more quick announcements about different things. People that have alarm systems were reminded to register them with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. The Florida Highway Patrol announced that they do not have ticket quotas and that they will implement in their training instructions to not be putting that message out there to the highway patrolmen. USS Philippine Sea returns back to Jacksonville. There was a new canine officer who got a lot of training at the Putnam County Sheriff's Office. They talked about alcohol-free zones and alcohol zones specific for selling alcohol at the Clay County Fairgrounds. They talked about tips for the eclipse upcoming and free glasses that they were giving away. They did the weather, then they went to commercial. They came back and talked about the state spending more money at the universities and the universities presidents having to plan for it. They talked about the Fresh Market store doing food sampling and food demos, and the Volstead bar would be remaining open despite the changeover in management. Then they went to commercial, and then they went ahead and went on in with their 6:30 report. So that is the landscape, folks. That is the landscape of where we're at right now with corporate news at 6 p.m. And I have a lot to talk with you about. Earlier in the series, I announced my rubric, how I was going to look at the news. And I'd also look at what is Jacksonville news. So everything kind of blends together with my analysis. So classy or lowbrow? I think probably the lowest thing that happened was WJXT's look at former Congresswoman Brown. They spent an out of proportion amount of time talking about what her future is. She's a former Congresswoman, not a current one. She is more part of our history than she is part of our present or future. But people have certain feelings in their hearts about things, okay? In-depth or superficial. You know, JXT did a lot of good stuff, and Action News did some good stuff as well. First Coast News did some good stuff. We're getting some in-depth here or there, but it's on different issues. You know, it's not something I can point to and go, you know, they're just completely focused. Real news or propaganda, again, we go back to JXT on the Corrine Brown thing. Timely or old model. The old model really being, you can still have basic, and you can still do really well with it. And I think WJXT shows that well. But they could really boost themselves by doing what Action News does. I really get turned on by Action News. They're kind of, they give me kind of the information. They give it to me at a quick pace, but they aren't afraid to go in and do some deep investigation and look at some things like that. Now, so helicopters, maps, video of what's going on now as the broadcast is happening. That's important to me. I live in a big city, okay? I live in a big city. Speaking of big cities, community and public service versus commercialism and capitalism. Towards the end of the broadcast, particularly with Action News and with the First Coast News, those two broadcasts that are the duopolies, they did here and there promoted some stores and some grand openings that I thought was inappropriate, totally off base. I don't give a darn about what's going on at Aldi's at Town Center, and I don't necessarily care about a bar, and that was addressed by JXT as well. So all these different things. So where do I come at when I look at the broadcasts? These stations are to operate in the public interest. I generally think that they are, but I sometimes yearn for more relevant information. And the closest it came to it was some of the crime alerts, some of the looking at what the sheriff is doing, looking at what's going on in the justice system. So when I looked at things, I felt like I was getting some good stuff from First Coast News and News for Jax, and I liked some of what I was seeing on Action News, that they were focusing on also looking at what was going on with threats on the city council president, something to be alert on. So the upcoming episodes, I'm going to look at the social media. We're going to look at my news feed, okay? We're going to look at my news feed and where these stations fit in. We're going to talk some great talk about the personalities. I really enjoy some of these personalities. I want to talk about them more at length. Then we're going to talk about the agendas. We're going to talk more about that. I want to thank you for watching. I have a lot to cover, a lot to talk with you about. I just got so many notes. If you could see it, I just got piles of notes of these broadcasts. Thanks for watching. Take it easy. See you later.